Very exciting afternoon plan that, just so you know, you really shouldn't pace yourself. Really don't pace yourself. Everything you got, because at 5 o'clock, we're all gonna have beers down the hill, okay?
We like beer.
Yes. I know we're in a policy school, but if we could have just gotten through the day. References.
No.
I often say that being here in Malibu, we're just far away enough from DC not to really worry much about what's going on there, but I can see that's not possible.
Yeah.
But speaking of DC,
Yeah.
I'm excited that Jonathan McBride could join us to be our afternoon keynote and kick off what is going to be a terrific set of conversations. I'm really excited about the sector perspective we're going to have with John Kamara, who's joined us here, as well as the panel on a really creative and innovative initiative right here in LA County that I hope serves as a model for how the government sector can be supporting cross-sector leadership. But we begin with Jonathan McBride. Jonathan is the managing director at BlackRock. Prior to this, he served as former assistant to the president in the Obama administration, as well as the director of presidential personnel. He was very much at the beginning stages of and the founding stage of the Presidio Institute Fellows, which we've mentioned before is really kind of being the foundation for this work. But as we've talked before, and this may be true of some of you, sometimes the way you find yourself in a cross-sector leadership is purely by accident. And oftentimes, and this is the case in my own life, you find yourself in the midst of a cross-sector career that you never planned.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think it's so important to have Jonathan here, who's seen this both from the federal perspective, obviously highest levels of the private sector as well, continuing to support this work, but also just from a personal level, I really am so excited for you to hear Jonathan's story in the journey into and through cross-sector leadership. And so without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Jonathan McBride.
Can you hear me okay without the microphone? I hate yeah. So I'm sitting down because I would rather have this be a conversation. Keynote suggests I'm going to talk at you as if like someone near me or myself had figured everything out. I'd much rather just have a conversation and talk about the things that are on your mind. Those could be challenges and things you haven't been able to address yet, where you want to talk about as things come together across different sectors, because that's where I spend all my time. What does that look like? Do I have an observation? You can also ask me a question you asked somebody earlier. Just compare the answers, why not? It's free. But basically have this be a dialogue about the things that are on your minds rather than me just talking at you. I can go a lot of different directions, but you know, Pete and I had a great conversation. I was in DC kind of talking about this session, and there are two I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background just so you have it, but there are two phases of my life I think that are the most cross-sector. One is right this second, actually, because I'm the head of inclusion and diversity globally for BlackRock. My boss, Larry Fink, and our firm manage about $7 trillion in assets. And I'm here, by the way, in my personal capacity, not representing BlackRock or anything else. But because of that, we're the largest shareholder in a couple thousand companies. You know, and he wrote a CEO letter that got published, would publish every January, that a lot of CEOs have to listen to because he's a big shareholder. But in it, he talked for the first time this year about purpose and about diversity as business priorities for companies. And the reason why I mention my job right now is because I took this job right before Brexit and right before the last presidential election in the United States, which I argue were two examples of people yelling at the top of their lungs that they weren't being included in their local economies. My sister-in-law is from coal mining, West Virginia. My brother, mom, and dad live in Long Beach. She's in coal mining, West Virginia. We're talking dirt road, hardcore. Every guy in her family is either a military officer or a coal miner or both. That's it, going back like 4 or 5 generations. Grandfather died of black lung, dad has it. So we're talking hardcore West Virginia. And that group of people who didn't love my former boss all that much we're basically voting in big numbers to say for 30, 35 years, my real buying power is down. and I'm watching the economy go up. So who's included in all this new economy? And every time someone said new economy on the campaign trail, they heard mine closing, no jobs, no health care for my kids, they're moving back in, and I can't provide them. That's literally, literally what they heard ringing around in their ears. And I think the Brexit vote was a little bit similar. It was like about, we need to worry about our people at home first before we're including everybody else, because we're leaving people behind. But what's happened in that period of time is some governments have delevered from the conversation, and people like my boss have been asked way more often, and with bigger and bigger microphones in front of them, as a leader of a private sector company, what do you believe? And what are the values of your company as if we're one human being? We're 14,000 people who don't agree on anything. But the private sector is being asked more and more to step in. So this is a cross-sector, cross-economy, cross-border, cross-cultural, cross-craft, caste, cross-whatever conversation suddenly, after being largely an internal conversation 2-3 years ago about how do you treat your people and do they feel like they belong. Like, this is a very different conversation. But the other period of time is my childhood. So I'm half black and half Syrian by biology. I was adopted at birth by 2 white parents. I was raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which has the dubious distinction of being every year usually the #1 or #2 most hyper-segregated city in the United States. I'd say Milwaukee, when we hyper-segregate, we do it well. But because of that, if you grow up, and my brother's half black and half Korean, some of you know him, but when you grow up looking like us and with our backgrounds, while you can be very active and try to be a part of all worlds, you know you're never a part of any one world. Like, you're very aware when lines get drawn, how does that play out? And yet we grew up in this amazingly interesting, diverse little hamlet within Milwaukee called Sherman Park, which has been studied many times. And I almost did a documentary on it. I was going back and talking to a whole bunch of people about what started, because I thought it was like a post-60s era, bring people together, fight the power, build their own future. No, economics. And all these people bought into a neighborhood where white flight had left, and these really great homes that once used to be prized were now cheap. So they could cobble together their shekels of $30,000 to buy a beautiful old Victorian-style home in a neighborhood. They weren't talking to each other at all until the city decided to build an off-ramp through the neighborhood. And so all these people had nothing in common. There were openly gay couples, there were Orthodox Jewish families, there was a guy across the street who had like Nazi swastikas. And everybody was completely separate until the city wanted to build an off-ramp. And they banded together, created the Sherman Park Neighborhood Association, fought the city, and won. And then they were like, wait a minute, what else can we do? There's this thing called school board. Maybe we got people elected, school do better. Maybe we could get someone mayor. And they literally, my whole childhood is a community of people working cross-sectorally based on the jobs they had, the access they have for that like 2 mile by 2 mile radius, and sometimes the city as a whole, but really caring a lot about that one neighborhood where they created this unbelievably cooperative environment. And I was just spent 2 days with my parents, and we were talking about a lot of this, and I was realizing that a lot of my predisposition on what's possible and not possible stems as much from that as anything else. So my background really quickly is I went to Connecticut College undergrad. I went to DC and worked for Herb Kohl, who was a US Senator from my home state for a while. I went back to business school after having a conversation with him in his car. I remember this vividly. He was a Harvard Business School grad, had run Kohl's food stores, Kohl's department stores, owns Milwaukee Bucks. He was a businessman, not a politician, and he promised he would say, listen, I'll write you a letter of recommendation for business school if you promise not to come back to DC. I was like, okay. And he said, go out in the world and like work for a really good company that teaches you something, maybe start a company, then come back. So my background is I went to Wharton, got a finance degree, went to Goldman Sachs, worked for 3 years, quit, started a media company with some friends based on a business plan we had written in school. It was for young professionals. Ran that for 6 years. Sold it to a company that did employment brand research all around the globe, and started trying to build a consultancy using all that data they had collected on places to work for 20 years. And then in a category of lucky, better than smart, I knew some people who were advising a guy who, myself about his skinny guy with big ears, who was running for presidency, and when he won, I was able to get my resume in front of the right people, and then quit, drop everything, and go down and join first as a deputy director of presidential personnel, and then eventually for the second term, the head of presidential personnel, which is an office you know a lot more about now. The fact that you didn't know me then is a good thing. But so if you think about it, I've had this cross-sector experience, but it's been kind of randomly walking through life. And it's funny, the job I have now, working for a boss who's like, by his own account, closer to the end of his career, having built this great company, and yet he's stepping out and putting a target on his back. And he doesn't need to, which I think is just heroic. I think it's great. It's like, I feel like my whole life led up to this job, even more than my last job. And Lenny knew me in my last job really well, and like, I thought that was kind of true then. It's oddly more true now. I spend more time talking about playgrounds and school classmates and dynamics that started very, very young in all different crowds as much as anything else. And so I feel like this is a uniquely cross-sector time. And if you take nothing else from this conversation, what I have been seeing both in my prior job and in this job, being right behind this individual who's in all these discussions at the CEO level and et cetera, is like, this is actually a good time. It doesn't feel like it. But, listen, if a dynamic going on in the world gets North and South Korea to say, hey, we should talk, there's a lot of odd pressures at bed pay, but it's bringing together strange bedfellows. People are willing to have conversations and think about things differently, sometimes just out of necessity at the local level. And so I'm a complete bull case. I'm an optimist right now. I actually think we're gonna look back on this period of time and say, that was a rocky period of time, but the exchange, the gift it gave us was it created some sense of crisis. And one of the things I know you've all been talking about is like, how do you break down sectors and kind of get people to bridge the gap and talk to each other? And right now it happens in crisis all the time because no one has any time to deal with all that crap anymore. Like all the prejudgments about each other. And we're in a little bit of a slow moving crisis. This is like the car accident where it's like happening at 1 minute a second. Like it's like, but it is creating really interesting bedfellows. And we're seeing it, I'm seeing it at a very high level. You're seeing a lot of people showing up and chipping in and actually believing in the business case around this more than they ever have before. Like we don't even have to have that conversation right now because they're feeling the implications from a community perspective. So I'm actually pretty optimistic. The one thing I wanted to talk about, and then we'll take questions, but I wanted to just talk, where did this start? I want to make sure that that's really what I'm here to do, is talk about the beginning of this whole thing. I was sitting in a room outside across the street from the White House, and we had convened a group of people. The Office of Social Policy, Sonal Shah, had convened a group of people to talk about something actually somewhat different. But it was a whole bunch of people, people running kind of the Corporation for National Community Service, and OPM John Barry was there, and a whole bunch of different people from different perspectives, and IDEO was kind of the design company was leading the conversation, and we had a couple of people from the outside, and we were trying to solve kind of some management related stuff. And we just got into a conversation about how even operating at that level a year and a half into the first term, it's just so funny how you walk into these rooms and you're walking in with people and you hear them talking about the people they're about to meet with. And there's all these like grade school prejudgments going on about motivations and behaviors and then you see in the room the assumptions that happen when someone hears something and how they react and everything else. And you're like, are we in 8th grade? This is ridiculous. But it's all going all across different directions. Like everybody's kind of assuming all these things about each other. And we started talking about that. And then we got into this conversation about foreign direct investment, and the connection between the two are the U.S. is getting killed by other countries who are doing a better job marketing themselves for investment by companies and new facilities. And it was Germany, Korea, all these other places where all the sectors go through one person who's like one connection from the leader of the country, the prime minister, who's like known to sell the whole company or country as a whole across all sectors. And we have Tennessee fighting with Virginia. Right? We have and so the idea was there's a real material cost when people can't get in the room and just talk to each other. And that was our cost. We decided that was their cost. So we started talking about it, and I keep pointing to Lenny because he was like you're one of the people I talked to like right after this probably. We basically said we could like start with grade school education and have people taking lesson plans and learning each other's language. We could like try to attack the middle layer, or what we see is there's like 500 people in America who could change this. Like literally, it's not that many people that if you could affect them at the top of these discussions, it'll then trickle down. And so we started so we developed this thesis. What if you got this cross-sector? Our theory was people needed to walk in each other's shoes and speak each other's language and have metric for it. That was like the spirit technology. I'm not kidding. It really wasn't that complex. Because they're operating in silos and they're just building up these expectations of each other. Every once in a while they get together and they just want to, they bring all that to the table. And so we said, well, what if there's a place we could go? And so we kind of started developing a theory, and then letting a couple other people helped us convene this great panel of about 50 people, the first meeting, 40 people, who were representatives from academia, not-for-profit, definitely for-profit space, different parts of government. And the question on the table was just, hey, does this thesis sound right? One, do we not work cross-sector very well? Two, are we leaving something on the table? And three, would you start at the top, middle, or bottom of the kind of workforce and try to address it? And the immediate answer was, yeah, it's a big problem. No one's doing it. There's a role for you to play as conveners. And then we started talking about where should it be. And here's the interesting thing, and this is why I think I'm excited about Pepperdine stepping up. Because I think this isn't a test of just whether cross-sector leadership can live. It's actually a test whether a school can do cross-anything. Because the first people in the room who said, don't put it in academia, were the academics. You remember that? Like, they all shot their heads, like, and we thought they were going to, Harvard, Stanford. They're like, no, don't put it in academia, because you're going to get dual and triple majors. You're not going to get cross. It's just too, like, siloed and hardwired and so on. That was their view at the time. They said, if you want to move fast, and you want to have, like, measurables in a year or two, which was our goal, it's going to take too long. You're going to be fighting a whole separate set of, like, historic battles in an academic context. So he said, locate it outside. That's how the house on the hill or building on the hill concept came, which ended up being the Presidio and now this. But like all the things that, and BCG's done a lot of research on this from a concept about breaking compacts that was like 40 years old. But all those compacts that people have designed and live up to, if you're the one who breaks it, you run for a long time. Like you can like establish a new business, a new field, a new horizon. Like if everybody thinks, hey, you just kind of have this, if you're in HR, you just don't get money to pay for data. So you spend no time researching the people you're hiring and what makes them best. And then when they produce a product, you spend $1 million test marketing the product. And they're going to produce 100 of them. If you're in HR and you can kind of believe that, you believe you'll never have data scientists in HR. And that's no longer the case. And so I'm excited about Pepperdine taking this on because I think this will be an interesting challenge to see if we can break that compact. We came out of the meeting with all those different groups realizing that our best role, and in fact this was very much the president's bias, that government slows many things down, but the one thing we can actually be great at is the inspiration, the start of something, because we can get everybody in a room and on their best behavior. You just put them in the Roosevelt room and leave the door open like you might walk in. And like, people will sit there and they'll be on their best behavior and their minds will be wide open. And so we realized we could do that. And so that's kind of what we did. We had a huge convening of a whole bunch of people all around government and everything else and started down a process and used kind of design thinking to get people out of their preset notions. And we started down this path. And then actually it ended up being, I think, pretty much like Matt Breitfelder, who was my partner at BlackRock, and a couple of people in the for-profit space and a couple of people in the philanthropy space who kind of kept running without us, actually. We had like far less to do with it. And then we were kind of reconnected about a year ago. Was it a year ago that we all met? And you guys a bunch of fellows came to BlackRock, and Matt and I got a chance to sit and meet with real human beings. They were the people we've been talking about for 7 years or something. And it was a really exciting notion. Like it was really cool to see the group come in and like be there live and in person. But I'm more convinced now that it's real. Like I happen to work for a guy who doesn't have these experiences, but he's coming to this realization on his own because he believes the right side of history. And I've seen how in 3.5 years, his personal change has caused these ripple effects that are huge. He would not have written that letter 3 years ago. It wasn't there. He wrote it this time, and the first thing that happened, I was at an event the next day, and a CEO told 400 people in a room, if you haven't read Larry's CEO letter, read it in the break, because the world has changed. And that same CEO then he's unnamed, but that same CEO got on a call that afternoon with dozens of Fortune 100, 500 CEOs, all on a call to talk about how they're going to push their boards on purpose and diversity using Larry's letter. So this stuff has like huge implications. So I think it's now is as good a time as any to kind of be thinking about these things. This is a great place to have that thinking be going on. It's also great to prove that academia can be the home of such things, because it does have great convening power. We had the White House, you got that. It's a good, don't tell a former president, but that's close. And so I'm really excited about it. And we will be, you know, we were talking a little bit earlier, like Matt and I and other people were involved earlier. I think you're going to see us get much more involved probably going forward. Because it really is a time for this more than anything else. Lenny, you were there for a lot of it. I don't know if you have anything to add from those early days and kind of some of the conversations we had.
Seems incredibly obvious in hindsight. It didn't at the time.
Yeah.
And you know, I think there were a lot of people simultaneously discovering from their own lens about why there was an opportunity in the space and it wasn't going to happen without a lot of energy applied to it in different ways. So
it's interesting with young people, and I don't know if you've seen this as well, but with young people, because at the White House, I did it. So the interns at the White House, there's 3 rotations: there's spring, fall, and summer, and there's 600 or 700 of them, and they're all different ages. People intern at like 60. It's really cool. And but it's really intense, and they get to meet everybody, including the First Lady and the President, like hour each and everything. And I did a session early on about kind of narrative and kind of just making decisions. And so I ended up kind of becoming part of the rotation for all the 5.5 years I was there. And I used to have a conversation with that group of people, and we used to talk about, it was interesting, as compared to my generation, I'm 48, we were talking about find the thing that you care about in the world. Map the ecosystem that has anything to do with that thing, and pick one seat and just start there. And be happy and actually look for opportunities to rotate. Don't stay in one seat or one vantage point. And what I explain to them is when you're the head of personnel for a president, and you're dealing with the biggest complex, diverse, cross-sectoral problems, because the world doesn't think sectorally. Challenges don't exist sectorally. The sectoral challenges get handled way down the channel by people who are expert in whatever that thing is. But that's like small percentage and smaller stakes. The big challenges are the cross-cutting ones. And the world produces them all the time because it doesn't really care about borders or politics or anything else. And so the rare group of people who kind of operate at that level can do that. And the younger people were already starting to think that. They're already starting to think that way. They're not. They still have a little bit of a sector mentality. It's really funny. It's like they've learned some of that from their parents and grandparents. So they still talk a little bit about sectors, but they're starting to think more horizontally. And I think that's kind of what we need to do as a general matter. I'll stop there and like take. I'm curious about. I know there's a bunch you all have been talking about. And you've been talking about how do we connect and build bridges to people across the sector. I'm happy to talk about experience at different levels. Glenn?
I was really struck by what you said, because for much of the day we've been hearing about cross-sector as a tactic, and you kind of presented it in a way that was maybe more organic, and you talked about how we really just need to understand different people, understand points of view. It's like connecting to each other as humans in a way that we don't have the chance to do in our daily lives. And it really looked at it as that kind of an opportunity.
Yeah, I would think about it as emergency room. So those of you if you've like gone in emergency room care, it's like gotten really interesting how they're improving emergency room care. Immediately they triage people walking through the door, and they have a checklist, and they decide really quickly: are you like a rote, understandable problem that can be solved by a single specialist? In which case, I move you over here. You go sit in one room, and somebody comes down. Or do I not know? In which case, we put a team around you immediately. Because the human body is like any other enterprise. You pull on something over here, something here moves, right? It doesn't follow rules that are based on, your heart doesn't follow rules because it's not your brain, right? So emergency rooms have learned how to do this. And I would say sectoral problems are in that first group. There's like, anything that comes up through a channel, a sector, that sectors exist for a long time, they know how to deal with. There's probably page 74 2A, right? And they can solve it. It's the other one where now the best treatment centers immediately get a hold of it, including people with holistic medicine experiences, right? That are kind of contrary to Western medicine. Immediately get a team around someone to try and start treating them because it's the fastest way to best diagnose something and chart the fastest patients. So you can think of it that way. That's one way to think about it. That's still more disaster response related. I would think the way I would think about it more is there was a period of time when we talked about the internet like a thing. Like we're having a conversation with this, we're having a conversation, and then the expert on the internet is going to come and talk about the internet, right? And this is my ambition for diversity, inclusion, and belonging, is that right now we're saying we're going to talk about strategy, operations, HR, and then we're going to talk about I&D. As opposed to we're going to talk about I&D, like diversity is called recruiting, it's how you assemble teams. Inclusion is a cultural element. Either your managers get the most out of each person because they know how to connect with people or they don't. Cross-sector, if you're gonna really think about it, you have to be as fluid as the world producing these problems. The world is not coming at this from a disaster perspective or from an asylum perspective. The world is completely dynamic. So you've got to figure out how do I design organisms that are going to respond to something in a like manner. It has to be a default. And I think, for me, the best experience was being an entrepreneur. When somebody like throws you in at the top, I was in a traditional publishing business, right? So we got like publishers, we got writers and editors, and we got designers and everything else. And they wanted to think like the old way, and we were like, no, we're 29, so we're just going to think about it differently. But that was a great experience. And so I think that's the way you want to try to get to an organism that operates that way. It's very hard, though. It's much easier to say, sitting in my seat, harder to do.
So I know you're not here in a BlackRock capacity.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in your perspective because I'm a little frustrated with the impact investing world.
Yes.
Because from my perspective, it's all starting with the financial return. And then if it also has a little purpose behind it, they're like, yes, it's impact investing. Versus starting with the problem we want to solve and then kind of working the economics back and saying, how do we get as much cost recovery as we can?
Yeah.
If we get to 100% and then some profits, then it's awesome.
Yeah, you're gonna hate me because when I took a job, including the head of inclusion and diversity job, one of the things I started doing is I started looking for more research. I just wanted to find more research and researchers, and we found a couple, getting Scott Page and Sheen Levine and a whole bunch of other people, and I found all this data that was mounding, like building in academia that no one had been sharing. And so we had kind of been at this for a while in our company, but I just said, let's talk with the most senior people, especially the investors, to see what happens. Because those are highly analytical people who don't operate on faith. And they're actually, for investors, you're kind of paid cynics. Like you're actually paid to be like, I don't think that's true. Everyone seems to really think that's the answer. That would suggest to me that there might be another way. And what we realized really quickly was that for 30 years we've been making the fairness argument, the impact argument, the personal experience argument, the CEO wants an argument on when it comes to inclusion and diversity. And you know what? Those people are convinced.